Hello, my name's Patrick Moran, and this is the Traveling Historian. Today, we're in hot, humid, beautiful southeastern Kansas, and we're going to talk about one of the most important events in American military history that you've probably never heard about. The film Glory, released in 1989, follows the 54th Massachusetts, one of the most well-known and most decorated African-American units during the Civil War. It's also a great movie. It has a great cast. It has Matthew Broderick, Denzel Washington, Morgan Freeman, that dude from The Princess Bride, and in my opinion, probably has one of the best final battle scenes in any movie ever made. Unfortunately, because of a text card at the very end of the film, most people think that the 54th Massachusetts was the first African-American combat unit of the Civil War. It wasn't. It was the 1st Kansas Colored, who were mustered into service right here on January 13th, 1863. So I'm here at Fort Scott National Historic Site to talk a little bit more about the events that led up to the formation of such a historic unit. Fort Scott was first constructed in 1842 and served as a fort on what was then known as the permanent Indian frontier. They patrolled the border between the United States and Indian Territory, and the soldiers that were stationed here were also involved in the Mexican-American War. The fort was later no longer needed and was sold to the public in 1853, and this became the nucleus of the town of Fort Scott. The town of Fort Scott was heavily involved in bleeding Kansas, and the Army returned in 1862 to 1865, and this served as a large Union supply depot and as a center for escaped slaves and refugees who were fleeing the turmoil that was now sweeping across the entire country. So we have to give a little bit of background first. Most people might be surprised to hear that Kansas was the location for the first African-American unit. But this is actually not that big of a surprise when you look into the history of the state of Kansas, and even going back to when it was a territory. The state of Kansas had always been on the forefront of the nation's struggles with race relations, the idea of the expansion of slavery, things like that. This stems from before the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The idea was when a state would enter the Union, they would enter 2 at a time. One would be a free state, one would be a slave state. That way, there wouldn't be one side that would have power in Congress. This changed after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The idea was that they would let the citizens of the territory vote for themselves in what was called popular sovereignty, and they would decide if they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. While that sounds really egalitarian on paper, what it actually led to was ballot stuffing, voter fraud, and lots of violence. This time period was called Bleeding Kansas. While we don't have the time in this video to go into all that happened during Bleeding Kansas, needless to say, most historians agree that the prelude to the Civil War actually started here in Kansas during the time period called Bleeding Kansas during the 1850s. We can't talk about Kansas politics and the politics of the pre-Civil War period without talking about James Henry Lane. James Henry Lane had been a politician. He had seen his opportunity to raise his political career, and he came out to Kansas when it was still a territory. Long story short, there's a lot of books that I'll recommend to you on this topic at the end of the video, but he was one of the firebrands that led to the eventual creation of the first Kansas Colored. What's interesting is his opinion of using black troops actually changed over time. In the very beginning, the idea was that we didn't need black soldiers. When the war first started, like all wars, lots of people expected it to be a short war. There were lots of African Americans who actually volunteered for service. Most of them were turned away. They were told, no, this is a white man's war, we won't need you. But as the casualties wore on and as the war went further and further, there was a realization that, you know, we need more soldiers. And that's when Lane and others started to make the argument, we're having all of these white men die to defeat slavery, why don't we let African Americans join the fight, they'll be motivated, and they'll help with our manpower.
The idea of using African Americans as soldiers is as old as the nation itself. There were free blacks present at the Battle of Bunker Hill. The 1st Rhode Island Regiment during the American Revolution had an entire black company, at first segregated and later became integrated. A whole gamut of freed slaves, Creoles, Indians, and pirates fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. In all of these cases, manpower shortages and dire consequences was the main motivating factor for the approval of black enlistment. While this was also the case with the 1st Kansas Colored, the moral and social implications of the unit's creation would differentiate them from all others who had come before.
Recruitment started in earnest in the summer of 1862. The recruits comprised mainly of escaped slaves, but there were some freedmen as well. By the end of the year, the unit could actually boast that it had recruits from over 15 different states and Indian Territory. Now, I know earlier I alluded to the film Glory, and while this video is not about the 54th Massachusetts, I do want to talk about the fact that the scenes that they portray of the stereotypes and of the prejudice that they had to overcome is very similar to the experiences that men of the 1st Kansas would have experienced as well. There were a lot of people that were not in favor of arming black men. There were a lot of people that didn't really think that they should be allowed to fight. They were issued with faulty 1807 Austrian muskets. Some of these worked really good, but most of the ones that they had didn't work at all. So the film demonstrates very much some of the same prejudices that men in the 1st Kansas would have experienced. While the 1st Kansas would not be officially recognized as a federal unit until January of 1863, in 1862, the unit operated as sort of a state militia. There were fears that the unit would be just for manual labor, but after Lincoln's issuing of the Emancipation Proclamation and due to increased guerrilla activity in Missouri, on October 26, 1862, Fort Scott's commanding officer, Major Benjamin S. Henning, then ordered the 1st Kansas Colored into neighboring Bates County, Missouri. This sent a detachment of 240 men on a collision course with history, later known at a place called the Island Mound. Most of the Confederate guerrillas, this is the first time they'd ever had to fight black men, armed black men, and so there was absolutely no quarter given. During this brutal hand-to-hand fighting, when almost all of the deaths that the 1st Kansas Colored suffered happened.